Boom. Hey team. Now here we're looking at and we're going over some general idea concepts, things to understand. We've talked about this a number of times. What's called GDP, gross domestic product. Now the GDP gross domestic product is the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a given time period, normally 1 year. And we're saying how much we're making. Now it's final goods and services. So we're saying GDP. We want to make sure, for example, a number of times people make mistakes intentionally. Remember we talk about people lying, gaming stats, stuff like that. For example, if you dig up, iron ore. Let me use this iron ore, and then you process the iron ore into, this won't show well. This might steel, and then use the steel to make. I'm gonna try to make an automobile, but an automobile, ugly automobile, but it will do. It's a really ugly automobile. Can make a tri-automobile, get a few tires. There we go. It's a dreaded triple-wheeled automobile. They actually tried this a few times way back when, well before I was born. But you know what I mean. They do it for trucks for low grade. But you know what I mean. They make, it's the steel used in the automobile is counted in the price of the automobile. So when that's sold to the customer, that is a final good. We don't count the iron ore or the steel because those products are used in a final good. Now, if an iron ore were exported, if we export the iron ore out, that would be counted. If we export the steel out, that would be counted because they left the country. Let's say we sold the iron ore to the Canadians. What they may do something else, but for the United States point of view, it's done. What it was generating for us has been given. So this is all final goods and services. We add them because we're engaged in what's called double accounting. So, for example, a few years ago, the New York Times did a thing called the 1619 Project. And an idiot doing calculations for it said, do you know that the U.S. GDP in 1860, 50% of it was provided from cotton? They were claiming that 50%, basically, they were advocating the cotton is king thesis. Because anything cotton touched, they double, tripled, and quadrupled bookkeeping, accounting, to make it immensely more valuable. If that were true, because if cotton, in 1860, if cotton, which is all grown in the safe South, were 50% of our GDP, the South would win the Civil War. They would have been able to use cotton to buy guns, weapons, everything, boots, clothes, improved railroads, the whole 9 yards would have won the war. Okay, why did 69 Project do that? Well, they were just, as I said, they were just faking numbers and lying because they wanted to create some weird fantasy land. Because they were counting what? The good at every stage. It was to be like counting, we're counting iron ore, and we're counting the steel, and we're counting the car. And so each of these stages are being counted. So if you had a product with 10 stages leading up to the final product may have been just say selling for 10K. But we're gonna each of those stages. So the first one may have been at 1K. The second one was being sold for 2K. Remember, because the first one, the third one, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They're adding up 1 through 9 on top of the 10. So it'd be like 19, 27. You see what I mean? So you'd be adding up all those pairs. You'd be adding another 50 to the 10. And so you'd be making domestic GDP look like it was 50,000 instead of 10,000. But the 10,000 contains everything that was before the 10,000 inside of it. That's why we do only final goods and services. Again, this one we just talked about. Final goods and services produced in the economy given time period, normally a year. Now this is a breakdown of goods and services. Now you notice there's government spending, there's business investment, plant, equipment, machine, because those are final, it's when I buy a machine, it's working today, tomorrow, the next day. That's the final good. Because I may sell lots of textiles because it's not being consumed in the textiles. It's making the textiles. An important distinction. And then the rest of the curve is consumption, which is actually over here. It's just, blocked by my head. A little bubble I'm at. But that's consumption. That's the domestic consumption, stuff like that. People consuming goods. Now you notice exports to the United States is actually negative. We import more goods than we export. So it means other countries, other people are getting a return on this. We are not, because other people have jobs and incomes by selling us goods. It's one of the reasons President Trump is there. Is he looks and says, "Hey, this is a negative. This is hurting the United States. We should make that at least what 0? Because if it was 0, in other words, we would import as much as we're exporting. The United States would have 4% more growth. We'd have a bigger economy at 4%. People would be living better. I'm not advocating somebody that would talk trade. I'm just pointing out where it is. So that's a drag item. Government spending. Now, government spending is, I'll say a number of times, it is government spending. 99.9% of what the government does is spend money. It is not investment, it is spending. I am not being cruel or anything like that. Okay, now GDP has devised is not always accurate. It doesn't always catch everything. It can be at times complex. Now we want to have an accurate measure of GDP, but we know there are going to be problems, things that make it off, not quite right. Some of them are easy, some of them, almost all of them make sense, and some tell us things. Let's do the first one. This one, do it yourself. GDP does not catch a lot of things done internally, particularly inside a town or inside a household, particularly inside a household, but also inside a town. So, for example, a lot of people want free childcare provided by the government because it'd be free. Well, you get the money from someplace. Now, a lot of that is done yourself. A lot of people will stay home and take care of their children. A lot of people will have grandparents or family relatives take care of their children. None of that's measured. That's a good service. In fact, you can make an earnest good decision to say, and this is we don't count it because it's too difficult, that a grandparent or an aunt or the parents themselves taking care of the child, doing it themselves, is far better than a stranger, because the person taking care of their own child has skin in the game. They want their child to do well. A stranger may only care as much as they're getting paid. If it's being done by the government can be indifferent, because remember, it's the government. When you fail, you use a reason to get more money. Let's talk about other do-it-yourself, because I've done some of these things. I admit I've only done that not at my current house. When I was a kid, I helped my father, using the term loosely, shingle the barn and shingle the house. I use the term loosely in the sense of I put the shingles on my back, climbed up the long ladder, making sure I don't look down, and place shingles on platform, also making sure I don't look down. It's the fear of falling in death. And when you're a kid, it's a lot less there than when you're an adult. But I think now I get a little queasy. When I was a kid, it was a lot easier. I admit that. But that was do it yourself. When I did a lot of painting inside our house. In fact, I've done it with my house here. When we painted some of our rooms, my wife and I, with the help of some of my kids, we painted our rooms. That is not counted. The only thing that was counted when you paint your own house, your own rooms, is the paint, because you bought the paint, unless you made it yourself. But we bought the paint. That's the only thing that's counted, the paint you bought. Now, do you live better? Yes. In fact, a difficulty that the British Parliament made regarding the American colonies is the American colonies did a lot of things themselves. Internal households, or even informal exchanges within small communities and stuff like that. A lot of things were done by themselves. And so the British Parliament said, why do you know that? Why should we, in fact, it says, why should we give the American colonies representation when we get this much from the American colonies? They generate that much, whereas the Caribbean colonies generate like that. In fact, we even see this repeated in some history books, fortunately not by economic historians, who will say, the Caribbean colonies are richer. It's like, the Caribbean colonies were full trading colonies. They didn't even feed themselves. They actually, produced sugar and tobacco, sold that, and they imported everything else. In other words, everything. Whereas if you're in a small town in Massachusetts, a lot of stuff was never recorded, because why? I went to the local cobbler. He was making my shoes. I went to the local tanner. he was making, leather when I needed leather. I went to the local seamstress, or even I made my clothes myself and weaved them myself. None of those things were recorded. In fact, the British thought the Americanized this because informally, do it yourself was making the American economy. Was by the time of our revolution, we were actually on a per capita basis already richer than the UK. Now, the UK was bigger, but see, they thought we were a lot, poorer than we were because it wasn't being measured. Do it yourself shows you people on the move who build, create, are moving. And so they may be a lot richer than you think, but they're doing so many things internally, you don't catch it. Okay, now, and this is great because it shows sort of the American colonies, had a lot more free money than we noticed. The only thing the American colonies, you don't notice when they buy things. So American colonialists a lot of times were buying books, firearms, and stuff like that, but it was not noticed. It was not covered. The British government didn't even notice it. It said, well, the Caribbean's buying that big because the Caribbean had to buy their food. The American colonists are growing their own food. The Caribbean had to buy and import shoes. The Americans are making their own shoes. And so none of these things are being recorded, but they're there. It means that people may be richer than it seems. So, for example, South Korea in the 40s into the early 1950s, my bad, South Korea was desperately poor. In fact, it was the poor section of Korea. We talked about that before. But anybody who looked at South Koreans saw they did a lot of things themselves. I could be a South Korean farmer living in a shack. And what am I doing? I am digging my own irrigation ditch. That's not being recorded. Because why? I'm doing it myself. If I brought somebody in and had them do it, that'd be recorded. Me doing it myself is not recorded. Eventually, once that irrigation system is finished, you're going to see output productivity rise, and then you're going to see an improvement. But you don't know where it came from because why? It was done itself. So there was this capital investment no one saw because it was done yourself. Okay. Now, the reason we don't measure do it yourself is actually easy. It's actually very simple. We don't measure because it's very hard to get accurate numbers. It's too easy to game. It's too fuzzy. It's too uncertain. So economists say, no do-it-yourself exists. No one is there. Don't try to measure it because it's too easy for it to be manipulated. It's too easy to be lied. No, me painting my rooms downstairs with my family is not as good as professional painters. What would you value that at? How do you know that? Well, the reason we did it was self because we didn't have the money. We want to pay professional painters, but we couldn't afford it. How do we value it? It's very difficult. So we don't. In fact, Americans saved lots of money going way back before cars got all massively, as someone said, modern cars are actually cell phones on wheels. Way back when I was young, my brothers had taught me how to do almost everything in an automobile in terms of repair. My brother and my brother-in-law. Keep praying for my brother-in-law because he's doing good, but he's just, he's had that, section of his lung has died. No cancer, thank God. But he's just a great man of the Lord and stuff. I love him. So, pray for my brother-in-law Jack that way. But going back to the point in terms of they taught me how to do that stuff. I'll always remember this day. My brother Tim told me when tuning up a car and changing spark plugs, do one spark plug at a time. Do not take out all the spark plugs. Because it's a pain getting the timing right on the alternator, stuff like that. It's like, okay. So it's like, I remember that. It's like you take one out, and you can't do that with modern cars because the computers will go insane. Americans did so it wasn't recorded. Americans were massive tinkerers. And in fact, in the Second World War, Americans could repair. We talked about this before with human capital. Remember with the tanks and trucks and stuff like that? American units, a lot of maintenance that would be done at the motor pool level were done by the individual people running the tank, running the trucks and stuff like that. And because they could do it internally, we're not measuring that, but that's what? That's increasing productivity. That's lowering costs, stuff like that. That's do it yourself. Okay. The other reason we don't do it, you don't measure do it yourself is this one. This one makes you want to just throw things. This is, Because we've all seen pictures of this. And keep in mind, I show pictures of a shanty not because I'm ragging on people in shanties. Because keep in mind, you go to American history, a lot of people do this. In fact, former senator from Georgia, former governor of Georgia, Zell Miller, he grew up in something like that. His mother was an art student, and when she was pregnant, his father died. They had this little piece of land that they were going to build their little house on together because he was like he knew construction and woodworking. He was a carpenter and stuff like that, but he died. She went, talked to the guy next door, and she says, "Can I go in your stream and get water and get rocks and stuff like that?" And he goes, "Yeah, sure, have fun." She built their house. In fact, she built and slowly improved over the time. She finished her art degree. She eventually taught in school and stuff like that. You have a lot of things yourself. How do you measure that? You know what a lot of countries do? A lot of these pillant, greedy, stupid governments do to poor people like this. And think of the impact on it culturally. You're a poor person. I am barely earning enough to feed my family. So I'm sitting there and I say, okay, how can I improve my house or have a house, something like that? And I go dumpster diving. I go dumpster diving and I build myself a little house. Because people wonder, why do people not do things they can do to improve? You know what the butt government does? Your lame, evil, greedy government does. Now, why is a person doing this? I have no money. I can barely feed my family. So I go off and get resources to build my house. The government say, oh, look, you built a $2,000 house. Oh, what kind is GDP? When they count as GDP, oops, sorry about that. When they count as GDP, the greedy little government says, oh, we need our tax revenue. You're avoiding taxes. Give us our tax money. Tax. You see the mayor of New York, so I'm going to pick on him repeatedly. He's like after everybody for tax. In fact, heck, you got a guy running for, Senate from Maine who's out with Bernie Sanders. The guy's like theoretically a national socialist. He's a freaking socialist, hot on socialist. He's like, I'm a working man. See, I got working man shirt on. It's like, he's a rich dude. In other words, he was a millionaire. He was born from a millionaire family and inherited from a millionaire. I'm just pointing out. Well, they want to tax these things. So the government comes up and says, I'm going to tax $200. Give me $500. Where's your money? $500. Well, I have $500 because all the money I earn every year is used to feed my family. Well, the government comes and says, give me my money. And the government will say, it's my money. It belongs to us. It belongs to people. I'm the free. And so the government will squeeze people. And so in a lot of places, people learn culturally, do not try to improve yourself. Do not get better. Do not learn how to work and stuff like that because your government's going to come and curb stomp you. And it is freaking greedy. And this is why, for example, in Haiti, after an earthquake a decade ago and change, Haitians were not improving things because if you tried to repair your house, the Haitian government would come along and say, oh, look at this. You did $1,500 in repair. The government's supposed to get 15%, 25% of that. You owe us $375. Why have you not paid us? We want our money. And then if you couldn't pay, the government would go and sell off. Which I can't pay because what am I doing? All my money is being used to feed my family. What do people learn to do? They learn not to work. They learn to be minimalist because there's nothing you can do to improve your life. Because if you try to improve your life, the government lands on you. And keep in mind, the government will teach everything like it's all a scam. You have people thinking that now saying, oh, it's a scam. Was it like New York City's like, we want to get rid of Amazon because they're destroying the city. Amazon's a scam. Walmart's especially a scam. What does Walmart do? They sell inexpensive goods at low prices. In other words, Walmart gives you a better deal for buying things than most grocery stores. Well, not grocery stores, but most things that sell other goods, other hot items. That's why people go to Walmart. They're like, no, Walmart's stealing from you. That way, when people go into the government, they can say, I'm stealing from Walmart. I'm stealing from the public because I'm just stealing. They were stealing from me. They're really thieves. No, when you're running a business, you can't be a thief because why? Customers have the right to say no. That's a great power. You don't have the right to tell the IRS, no, I'm not paying. See, but you cannot do Walmart. Okay, used goods. Now, used goods are great. I love used goods. Used goods are fantastic because used goods help the poor and middle class. They give them access to more goods. I hate it. You have government officials, I'll pick on this one again later, stuff like that, who, they'll want to get rid of used goods because then the people will buy new goods. In fact, during the recession, the Great Recession, the government tried to ban the sale of used goods. And we're saving the environment, we're saving people. And no, what they want to do is force people to buy new goods because new goods are recorded in GDP, used goods are not. But used goods help the poor and middle class live better because that frees up resources to buy other things. I mean, heck, I always use used cars for an example because used cars are massively useful for people. They do what? They expand your looking range for a job from there to there. Now you can find the best paying, most efficient job for you that might be over there, and you can live over here because it saves you up money. Why do that? Because I could get a $2,500 Wonder car. It runs, has four wheels, it's good. I expanded that. So in other words, I'm getting better living conditions by being over here. I'm getting a better return, better job by being over here. And the people employing me are getting a better deal over there too. So it's a win. If we're just stuck, you have a lot of people just like, oh no, people should just be in these small little apartment blocks, the commie blocks as they're called, and oh, it'll be so wonderful. Now they don't mean them. They mean the peasants. The funny thing is, when people talk about those things, they forget the United States actually tried creating commie blocks decades ago in the 60s and 70s, urban renewal and stuff like that. They quickly became areas of pestilence. We'll deal with that when we get a chance, but that goes social decay and such. But used goods free up resources you can spend and buy other things. It allows people to live better. It allows people to have a better standard of living because, they can say, I always use cars for example, almost anything. We do a lot of consignment sales in my house because that saves money. That means other things are thrown away, we can get other things. It improves our standard of living. A lot of countries ban used goods because, a lot of them say, oh, it's for the environment. It's for the environment. No, it's like, it's so people have to buy more used cars. Not everybody can buy a new car, so a lot of people are cut off. But then they like that too because the fact of it, it clears things up for the powerful, the elite to live better and to get what they want cheaper. Governments often abandon, I mentioned before, they ban used goods. In fact, when they did this cash for clunker thing, right? The government not only took this is cash for clunkers. One thing was, we're saving the environment. All these old cars pollute. They're polluting and destroying, and the poor little panda bears are dying, and we're going to get rid of them. You know what the government did with these cars? Now, again, these cheap cars would allow people, poor middle class people, to have transportation. We're going to get rid of that. Not only that, but see, a lot of people, when they're doing repairs, they use parts from. No, sorry, I'm being bothered by a gnat, the G sound, I know. But they strip down the car parts out of those to repair cars. Because why? It's cheaper to use used parts, and that saves what? Resources for people getting repairs. Well, when these cars are sold in, and the government paid you to sell the cars in or bought it from dealers to destroy, the government would destroy them. Not only destroy them, the government would take acid, pour it into engine blocks and on pieces of the automobile, so they wouldn't be used for repairs. People have to go and buy new repair parts and make the economy look better. But think about it, if they're dumping acid on these things, they dump acid on them, they leave them in landfills. You just increase the toxic waste component. No, since the bill said it is green and saving the earth, its pollution did not count. Literally speaking, they did not count that pollution. A lot of countries, in fact, when you've had damages from lithium mining, because it's very toxic waste intensive, they'll say, oh, that's mining. That's because of coal mining, something like that. Or that's because of fossil fuels. which is getting to the next one, I know. Okay, well, the one after. Underground economy, the black market. Now, again, the underground economy, black market, is, legally speaking, people are maybe seeking to avoid the government. That's what I call minor illegal. In minor illegal, the weight of tax and regulations have forced people underground. In many countries, you cannot get a license. You have to have a license to be a painter, and you can't get a license. In fact, even in the United States, to become a plumber in most big cities, the Plumbers Guild, the Plumbers Union must approve you. If they don't approve you, you can't be a plumber. You can be a great plumber, but we haven't approved you. Why do they not approve you? Because they want to make sure their own people get jobs employed. So that's minor illegal. The weight of tax and regulations force things underground. And remember, how does this happen? Your government here really wants to eat well. Governments do not do diets. The idea of a diet is, instead of my 13% increase, they only gave me a 6% increase. Oh, I had a 7% cut. They're cutting me to the bone. And remember, when governments are faced with cuts, governments cut things to do the most damage to people, so people give the government more money. Now, the government can know they're wasting $2 billion over here. They won't even care about that, because why? If I get rid of that, the public will give me more money. If I eliminate lunch programs for children, the public will give me more money. And there's major illegal. These things are banned because they are bad for society. We may cause these things to be underground. But the reason they're underground is we don't want them around because they are dangerous. Remember, in minor illegal, the way the government has forced people underground. In major illegal, we have banned these activities because they would damage society, have a negative effect. So we ban them unless those activities go underground. We ban them for probably a good reason. And the last one, this is one that's come in the last 2 decades. This is one that used to happen in communist countries. Sorry, I gotta walk a bit to clear my physiology here. It used to happen in communist countries. It used to happen in other situations, but not in advanced nations, because lying was considered wasteful, inefficient. But our government saw other ones. Lying could be good, and so because used to be, if I was working in the labor department, what's my job? Record labor statistics. If I'm wearing, for instance, I just record income. I do my job. I add up, say this is what it is. There's no one worried about it. Same thing with GDP. We just add up and say, here's what it is. Well, what is the government found? It could fake things. It could lie. And with the rise of communist influence, even though communism has failed economically, its adherents are very much, I mentioned before, them in the military, among high generals, and in academia. Anything to suit my end, to improve what I'm going to do. And so it became, it has a spread of amoral. Do whatever you want. Lying has increased remarkably so. So the government's lying to suit's end. It doesn't change reality, then people don't listen to it. They don't know what reality is. They don't know what the truth is, because why? The government's lying about the truth. And people make mistakes acting on things that are not real. So, for example, if roads are covered in ice, everyone will slow down. You have more people on the roads, and there's going to be more clogs, stuff like that. If the government just said, well, the roads are not covered in ice, they're clear, everything looks like it can go faster, but the roads are actually covered in ice. People don't realize they're covered in ice, they suffer damages. You have greater mistakes happen. But if the government's not paying for it, if they can blame someone else, they'll go ahead and do it. Okay, nominal versus real GDP. Nominal GDP is what is called the face value GDP. That's just the number value. Real GDP is what are we actually getting in real output. So, for example, a lot of times you may hear, well, in 1939, the US GDP was $100 billion. True. And today we're $30 trillion. So obviously our GDP increased. Let's see, from 100 billion. So that's 10. That's 100, 300 times. Now our population tripled, so the per person GDP would be increasing 100 times. Wow, we must all be rich. No, this was called inflation. What is the rise of price? See, we measure GDP. We don't want to measure inflation. We want to measure what do we gain in real output. And that's why I have this simple equation. If you have $30, same $30, and last year say you had $10, but gasoline cost $1, so you got what? You get $10 of gasoline for $1 each. You have 10 gallons. If this year you're getting paid 30, but gasoline costs $3 a gallon, you're getting 10 gallons of gas. You had no improvement in your living standards because why? I'm not getting any more gas. I got more money, but the money, all the gas costs more too, and it was no increase. We want to measure output in real goods. Now, if instead the price stayed around $1, but you're getting 30 now, and you used to have $10, 10 gallons of gas, but now you're getting 25, you are living better. And so that's why we want to measure. We want to understand what is real, what are we gaining in actual output, and that's what we wish to measure. And that is real GDP. Now, the business cycle goes with GDP. I'm sorry, I have to walk again. I apologize. It's also because all the rain and stuff like that's got my sinuses. So I'll probably have to blow out my honker nose in a minute. I apologize for that too. But the economy will go in what's called a business cycle. Boom, recession, bust, recovery, boom again. You can use any of these terms on an exam. And what is it's not a smooth. In fact, I like this example of business cycle because it's going up and down, moving upward. Most times they put business cycles flat and it makes it seem like a sine wave function, which everything cancels everything else out. And so, we want to measure actual increases in real output. That's what we're looking at the business cycle. I need to measure increases in real output. That's what we're seeking to do. So your business cycle can have long booms. This is where we're going to the next one. Now you have the boom. Well, let's go through the definition. We'll go through the graph. I apologize. You can have the boom peak. That's when the economy's growing. For the United States, we want to beat 2% real GDP growth. We do that. In other words, growth, not inflation, just gain that much goodies. That's considered growing. We beat that. What's going to tend to happen is incomes will rise, unemployment will fall. A recession is when the United States slows down below 2%, or we go negative, we tend to hit a recession. During recessions, unemployment rises, incomes fall. We don't like those. Recessions are followed by bust or trough. This is low point. The economy is bottoming out, may even be going more negative and stuff like that. In recessions, sometimes, a lot of times, recessions and bust, the term recession is used for recessions and busts. So it's used for both parts. But the bust is the low point. Then there's recovery. That's when your economy starts to grow beyond 2%, but you'll see it like, in other words, we're going at -1. And we keep growing and growing, increasing, and we get to 3. We've now what? We're in a recovery. And that's real GDP. Now, for decades, the classic definition of a recession for decades was 2 quarters, 3 months, and then another 3 months of negative economic growth, negative real GDP growth. That was an established rule. And that rule was established to have a set major benchmark, which we want it locked in so it'd be easy to say, boom, there it is. We can know it. We can look at it. It wasn't perfect, but they went with that because it presented a nice stock line. It's like going below zero. When you went negative, you went below zero, everything went below zero. And for 100 years, that was the definition. But then go back to what we said before, the government lying. In 2022, we had 2 quarters of negative economic growth. That's when you would declare, with someone from the labor department, one of the departments go, we have entered, a Treasury Department would come and go and say, we entered a recession. We're now in a recession because we had what? 2 quarters of negative economic growth. Oh, no, 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 no. The economy's doing great. Wait a minute. Why they, for lack of a better term, why did they lie? Because they didn't want to have an economic recession. It would make the government look bad. There would be a hit on it because we'd have the impact of the recession. And the government didn't want to take the political hit of saying, oh, we're in a recession. And so the government just said, no, it's not a recession. It's more complex than that. It's like, no, we went with the simple thing because it was an easy way. It was a simple delineation, but they changed it because they didn't like the results. Now, I have 2 recession boom periods in. You can have long periods of high economic growth, right? And I do mean high economic growth. For example, let's take this blue from 1983. I lost my boom. Let's see. From 1983 to 2007, the United States had an economy that was dominated by long, because look at that trend line of real GDP going up. In fact, we didn't even have a negative growth here. We had 2 shallow recessions. There were 2 years, 1990 and 2001, in which the economy was declared a recession because we had 2 quarters of economic growth, but for the whole year, the economic growth was positive. But we hit the 2 quarters. You have short, shallow recessions. Those are great. And then you can have long, bellowing, bold growth periods. That's why 83 2007 was so loved, is the fact of things were getting continuously better. Or you can have what we've had for the last, I have 2022, in which you have short growth periods and deep, hard recessions. In other words, during the teens, our average growth rate, especially during the first part of the teens, was less than 1%. In other words, there wasn't this giant big boom of which we're, doing great. We actually had long periods, 70s, before 83, from 73 to 82. Most of the years were negative growth years. We had long, deep recessions, short, tiny booms. And so, that slowly changed. And that's a good thing. So you can have that range there. The reason I put them both there is to give you an idea of what it means. Okay, now break-even growth, which I've mentioned a few times. What rate of real GDP growth does the nation need to stay even? Because the United States has immigration and population growth, we need about 2% just to stay even. For our economy, on average, for the number of jobs with new people coming in, for incomes not to change and stuff like that, just to stay even, we need 2%. We go above 2%, we tend to see unemployment fall and basically real GDP grow, but more importantly, we tend to see people's incomes rise, usually faster than that 2 or 3%. In other words, when we're doing 2%, you may not even see your incomes rise. When we have 3% economic growth, 3.5%, then you see people's incomes, they tend to rise a little bit faster than even GDP growth. Now, Japan has no immigration and a negative population growth. So the Japanese break-even growth rate is 0.3%. In other words, the Japanese, it's easy for them to trade water. You don't even need to. If I'm Japan, I didn't get the nap wrap. You don't even need to create one new job in Japan because your population is shrinking. I'm Japan because my population is shrinking. My population is going slurp. I can just keep the same number of jobs. Which, if I'm Japan, I had the same number of jobs today in 2026 I did in 1990. My population is doing fine. If I'm the United States and I have that same situation, we are short 40 million jobs. That's the killer. I'm not being cruel. I'm pointing out in terms of, so the United States, because of our growth rate in immigration, we need 2%. Japan, because they have negative population growth rate and no immigration, they only need to hit 0.3% to break even. Okay, then a lot of times we look at GDP growth rate per capita. How are we gaining per person? In other words, you can look and say, well, the United States economy, it looks huge because we're so big. How are we doing per person? How are we improving in growth per person? What's cutting up by each individual? How are they doing? What is your growth per capita? Because countries have a high population rate, let's have looking to have a great GDP, but they're not realizing anything. So what is the growth per person? This is a point I made before. For example, Germany lives poorer than the poorest U.S. state. In other words, per person wise, the poorest American state lives better than Germans. And so I do a look at things per capita times to see how the people are doing, the per person is doing. Then we'll look at absolute changes. How am I doing compared to myself? In other words, if we go back to the previous page and see that graph with the growth rates, the blue, how am I doing compared to ourselves historically? Have we beat historical norms? When I picked on the early teens, the theoretical coverage from the Great Recession, our growth rate, normally after such a deep recession, the United States grows in the 4, even up to 7-point range. We did not. We had a giant recession. We were growing at like 1.5, 1.6, and the government lied about inflation, trying to make it look better. We were barely growing. We did not reach that 2% standard. So by absolute standards, we were failing. Compared to the other industrialized countries, though, the Canadians, the Germans, the British, the French, the South Koreans, the Japanese, we were doing pretty good. Our real GDP was growing faster, than theirs. So, and that's why I said they look compared to say, and lots of people get relative to see how others people are doing. Are we doing better than them? Or is somebody like us doing great? We can duplicate them, as we'll see later. We're going to talk about gaming growth rates. Okay, inflation. Now, inflation is something I disdain. I hate it. One, because it goes and it bogs me. It bogs all average people. I hate inflation. Inflation is the rise in prices from year to year. In other words, bread cost $1 back in 2008. Bread now costs $3. In fact, heck, I was going shopping the other day and bread cost $3. By 2012, bread was costing almost $3 a loaf. That's inflation. How much money do you need to buy the same stuff you got last year? That's the rise in prices. As inflation rises, money buys fewer goods. Each dollar you have buys less because why? It's there. Someone had pointed out a few years ago saying in 1990 when they had Home Alone, this is what he bought with $25. They show the cabbage. If you're doing that in 2022, you couldn't get that much. In fact, to buy that much, you have to be spending something like $120. Just to give you an idea of an example how things have, and that's the rise of prices. People, consumers hate the rise in prices. The rise in prices hurts the common people. It hurts the poor, it hurts the middle, it even hurts the lesser rich. Government, as we'll see, eventually loves inflation because, again, it benefits the government. Now, inflation is often broken into two pieces. The PPI, the producer price index, is saying these are the raw materials and goods used in the production of output on the firm side to the supply of goods. So the purchasing price index says these are the items we use to make things. how are their prices going up? And so that can get very expensive. So, and usually that tells you shortfalls in supply that are coming forward because of bottlenecks. Okay, and then there's the consumer prices, one I want to cover. This is an index measuring how are prices hitting consumers. I know I'm talking about a bit. What it is basically because I'm old, fluid will settle in my legs, and I've got to move to keep the fluid from settling in my legs as much. And so it gets me, I get a little antsy. If you ever had me in class, I really bounce around. But this is so you can understand, what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Okay, so the consumer prices is a weighted index of the goods bought by consumers. Now, because we want to measure just the increase in prices. We don't want to measure the increase in other words, in GDP, you want to measure the increase in output. Here, we want to measure how much it costs. We say, how much will it cost you to buy the same good? And so these are the goods consumers buy. Now, this is called a weighted index. And a weighted index is done because you want to see the impact on customers. So, for example, we were talking bread a minute ago, right? Let's take off my glasses and clear. I'm sorry, my allergies and stuff like that have really got me. And so, it's making me go. Blah, 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 blah. Yes, I'm wearing my Godzilla shirt. Isn't it cool? I like Godzilla. I've always liked Godzilla. I was a little kid, I love Godzilla. But we're talking bread, right? Now, bread. Now, okay, bread costs $3. It went up for one. Now let's just say gold. I know gold is way up there, but it's gonna be simple in my head. What if during the same time period, gold went from, let's say, 5K an ounce, to be simple in my head, and it dropped in price to 1K an ounce. Now, see, the reason we must weight this is by price, gold is more important than bread. But for the consumer, bread is more important. So we must call weight this. We must weight it by the amount that people buy. Because people buy tens of billions of loaves of bread a year. We don't buy that much gold a year. But gold would have the bigger weight in the index. I'm going to do some simple heads. It's like, think of the index being for bread, 1 billion. So be easy on my head. And the index of gold, because doing an ounce, let's just say 1,000 ounces. We're using your weights. Now, the price makes it look like when we weight it by the the weights, it was the original price was 5,000 times 1,000 plus $1 times a billion. So what happens? The bread gets greater weight. It shows you the bigger impact on prices for consumers. Gold gets a smaller weight because we're not buying as much gold. Gold's expensive, and it's got a big price decrease. We want to see what happens to people. So this consumer prices says, what do people buy in what ratios? We create a weighted index to find out, does this work? How does this function and such? Now again, being a weighted index, and that's the mathematical calculation. I'm not worried about it per se. The book quizzes will go you over that a few times, so I know. But because of the complexity of creating the index, creating the weight, we do this index about every 20 odd years, every 18 to 20 years. So the first major index of the CPI was done back in 1969. The second was done in 1987. The third was done about 2005. And they're in the process of doing another CPI right now, which will probably be post-dated 2003. I mean, not 2023. They may post-date 2025. I don't know. I'm not being this because that one hasn't been. I don't think they've said it. I'll check. I get the other computer in front of me. Okay, 2024. In other words, 2005 and now 2024 was the new base year. And so I have to type in now 2024. We're doing the one, we now have it. Didn't find it clear, I'm not being cruel there. It's like, okay, now the CPI is not fully accurate. It's one of the reasons why I just changed the slide so I can't. One of the reasons why we do an index every 20 years because of these problems. But these problems cannot be accounted for constantly. And so that's why we redo an index every 20 years. But it takes about 2 or 3 years to construct an index. In other words, 2024 is going to be the base year. That reset is going to be finished now. This summer, they're going to have it finally done to say, this is what our new base year lines up 2024. And they'll line it up with 2005, 87, and 69. Okay, why do we have to redo it every 2 decades? First one, new products. There were products that didn't exist. In other words, 1969, there were no personal computers. These bad babies did not exist. There were no cell phones. There were a few satellite phones in 87, but, there were no real cell phones. There was no that stuff comes in the 90s. CDs came out, and then it went electronic. That came out. CDs came out in the late 80s, early 90s, stuff like that. These are new products that didn't exist. They come out. They change things. Because they're not recording the CPI because it didn't exist. Now, related to new products is product improvement. Now, a lot of economists say do not go insane over product improvement because a lot of people use that to try to hide inflation. Products are so much better than they were. Economists don't like playing that game because it's too dangerous. It forces the government wanting to lie or fake, saying this is so much better. Remember, we talked about it in the sense of when they said a East German Trabant was equal to a Cadillac. Remember that they said said stuff like that. Oh, it's the only thing it exceeded Cadillac in was it generated more pollution than a Cadillac. Although the comical thing is, Greens were so ideologically driven by hating markets and being communist that if you go back to the 80s, you'll have Greens saying, if only we were all driving Trabants, we'd be saving the environment. Trabants are more pollution intensive than Cadillacs. How would you be saving the environment? No, it's a people's car. It's made by a wholly communist country. They said stuff like that. They're idiots. I said, I love a clean environment. A lot of the people in the environmental movement are nuts because they don't really care about the environment. They care about changing the social and economic structure of society. The funny thing is that law should destroy the environment. That's why I pick on it. Okay, product improvement though. Let's deal with computers. These are standard level computers for each of these years. A 1977 computer costs about $5,400. Its hard drive, its thinking brains was only 10 kilobytes. Its storage was 1 megabyte. In other words, itsy bitsy. By the time you get to 87, a decade later, the price of computers went 54 to 18. But think about how much has changed. It went from 10,000 kilobytes of hard storage to 6,400 kilobytes. In other words, the hard drive, thinking about the computer, increased in strength 64-fold while the computer became cheaper. My storage, 20 megabytes. You can't see it. You can see it in the PowerPoint yourself. But, you can get a stripped down computer for like 600. Its hard drive will be a gigabyte. In other words, it's a gigabyte of brains. We're doing this with automobiles. See, I can say earnestly, without a doubt, that a 1967 automobile is in performance similar to a 2026 automobile. A friend of mine had an old Mercedes from '79. The thing performed, moving, speeding, stuff like that, very similar to a current car. It was a fuel chugger, but it was a very equivalent performance. With computers, we're putting the performance in, so we're not trying to game things. If I took the performance level improvements for computers and compared it to cars, this would be like the first computer doing 60 miles an hour on average. And then today, the computers you can buy now, so in automobile equivalents, could do 1,000,000 or 10 million miles an hour. In other words, basically, your car would be able to fly. You go around the earth in a few seconds, or a few minutes at least. And that is a product improvement, that's a massive change in how things work. So we can't compare current computer. Always have to say, oh, poor people suffer computer poverty. They can get stripped down computers rather easily. No, they must have cutting edge, otherwise they're ripped off. Why? So that's envy culture. Taste change. Now I admit this is a chart for me. It's like meats. Yes. If you're vegan, cool, you can be a vegan. There's nothing wrong with that. Different taste. Taste change. People buy something different. The 1967 stuff we buy in 1969 is not the same as we buy today. In fact, just using meats here. In 1969, the United States was a heavy beef eating place. By 1987, chicken had displaced beef. By 2005, chicken was displaced by meats in general. In other words, we're going to being back, more balanced with what we ate for meats. And so that's just taste changing. Like I said, this chart's not to pick on the poor vegans, because I may pick on vegans some like that other times, but this is just preference. It's what people, utility-based preference, what you like to consume. That's it. And if people invade big vegan, yeah, okay, we have to change weight because why? We have fewer meats, and now we have more people having, beans, having, various vegetables and fruits, of which I like them. In fact, we just cut another watermelon the other day, but unfortunately, the kids and my wife got to it. I didn't get to have any of it. Very sad. So taste change. Substitution effect. This one, it's been general. It's a common been known for decades that people shy away from high prices. In other words, that when prices go up, people shy away from them. They go away from high prices because they are expensive. And so we go away from goods that cost more towards things that are cheaper. So for example, more time we're in the grocery store shopping, there are some things we'd like to have. It costs too much. We don't get them. We get other things. So, for example, we got frozen pizza because they're having 2 for $7 day. And we may have wanted something else, but that was what? That was always expensive. We got the rotisseries because that was what? Cheap. It may not be our preferences, but it was less expensive. I'm not being cruel or anything like that. I'm pointing out. And it was discovered over time that the substitution effect means that inflation is overestimated by about 30%. What I mean by 30% is when inflation would measure at 3, it would probably be really 2.1%. Now, in the 80s and 90s, this stuff was all realized, and lots of surveys since improving it. But back then, when I was young, the general consensus among economists was just realize substitution effect exists, but don't try to correct for it because it's too messy. And over time, goods even out the prices anyway. Because everything else is concrete and measured. Once you allow adjusting or lowering the inflation rate, because substitution effect, which does exist, but it's the alternative, you run the potential of this occurring. The government could pull items or lie to make the CPI look better. Again, this used to never happen in any industrialized countries. We didn't do it. The Canadians didn't do it. The British didn't do it. The Germans didn't do it. The Swedes, the Norwegians, the French, the Koreans, the Japanese. None of the industrialized countries. Taiwan didn't do it either. None of the countries. Singapore does not do it. None of them ever pulled items from the CPI. This was not done. They said, well, it's substitution effect. Substitution effect. They don't even pull for the substitution effect. You just, want to measure. Okay, why? Well, this is easy. Back in 2009, especially because of our green policies, the government pulled food, grocery store food was pulled from the CPI. Restaurants were left in, but grocery store food was pulled from the CPI. Gas was pulled from the CPI. Energy was pulled from the CPI. In other words, the government intentionally took these out of CPI, saying, well, our gas prices are biasing up the inflation rate. It's really not that high. We spend 2 to 3% of our income on gas. Yes, it should be in there because why? We buy gasoline. It's making it inaccurate. No, it's telling exactly what people are facing. And so during the late noughts in 2009, 2010, the teens, 11, 2012, something like that, U.S. inflation rate was pushing not the official 2%, was probably pushing 4 to 5 or 6%. And there may be a time we'd actually hit 9 or 10. But the government said, let's biasing it upward. It might make the politicians look bad. So the politicians pulled. They actually pulled the stuff out. They pulled it out. It wasn't put back until 2017. Then in 2021, the government pulled them again. And they say core CPI. Now they say core CPI, which does include the volatile things like energy, food, and gas. People need to eat. That's part of core. They included luxury goods as part of core because why? During recessions, luxury good prices go down. But no, luxury goods. In fact, that's one of the things you have to just go back to for. You have to realize substitution effect with. Food, you kind of need that. Gasoline, yeah. In fact, the only food they kept in was restaurants because during recessions, restaurant prices tend to flatline and go south because people are tightening their budgets. And so food prices tend to be bled a little bit. I should say restaurant prices bleed a little bit. So the government intentionally did this to create the fakery. Totally unethical, but yes, they did it. Anticipated and unanticipated inflation. Okay, this is when, roughly speaking, you don't see inflation. If you don't see it anticipated, you see it coming. That's like having a snowstorm. If you know the snowstorm's there, you can deal with it. You can deal with it. If you don't see it coming, you're blindsided. That's like going driving and you didn't realize there was going to be ice in the road and you hit a patch of black ice and off you go. In fact, this idiot who cried there was probably saying, I want to be doing 70 miles an hour in a snowstorm because I'm an idiot. You could say, well, that was unanticipated. Well, sometimes it's anticipated. Unanticipated inflation does more damage because we don't see it coming. This is why the gaming of the numbers, the government lying, is so horrible because it exists anyway, but you don't see you're being stalked by the killer. That's an unanticipated inflation. Both of them cost energy. They both hurt people. They reduce standard of living. They make it harder on populations. That's why anytime you have a government official saying, "Oh, we need higher prices," like, boom, fire that sucker. That sucker should not be in the government, any government. They should not be allowed to be a school teacher because they's an idiot and they want the average person to suffer. Boogie them. I want the average person to live well. I want the poor person to live well. Anything's going to cause higher prices hurts the poor and the average. No, I'm not doing anything against the rich who want tax or anything stupid like that because that doesn't work. The rich can take care of themselves. That's all I mean. Big government does not make you get the rich more. No. We'll deal with that one later. Okay, a lot of times inflation will be blamed for things. In other words, now I'm using this one because of an objective because I can pick on it. It's like what is it? The new CEO of Disney came out and said, "Oh, blah, 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 blah. Our policies are great. The people aren't going to movies. They're a bunch of reactionary. Oh, I'm not involved in the culture war." He gets involved in the culture wars. He gets involved in cultural objectives. We like our new, whatever 19 sexes, genders, or whatever they are, saying things. We like insulting religious. In fact, the new Superwoman came out and insulted religious people and said, "Yeah, you Christian fathers, this movie's gonna make your daughter's pagan." Um, this is a big, you know, hand gesture towards you. And then wondering, oh, why is the movie gonna do bad? You hide a star who hates people gonna go to the movie, which means people are not gonna go to your what? Your movie. I'm not being cruel. That's what it is. In fact, movies today and half for decades blame their whole trouble on inflation. Oh, people are not going to the movies because of inflation. It's inflation. Now, inflation, when I use the term inflation since the 30s has gone up about 40-fold. Movies in the 1930s cost 3 cents. They cost over $15 a day today. In fact, in the 30s, when you bought a movie for 3 cents, you could stay in a movie theater through several features. In other words, if this were 1930s Greenville, you go to downtown Greenville, pay your 3 cents, start be in the theater the whole day, because especially when you got in the summer, because we would do that in the summer because they had AC. And what people do, we'd come and I'd be watching the, Flash Gordon serials and the cartoons, and then we'd shift to three or four features. And so the family would actually stay in a movie theater for 6 or 8 hours watching movies. If you left, you have to get, pay again. That's what they were, 3 cents. We're being generous. We're not counting if you get more movies, just saying 3 cents. Cost 15, over 15 today. If we account for the general rise in inflation, which has been about 40-fold, 3 cents would go to $1.20. In other words, the decline of movies, not the death, the decline of movies has nothing to do with inflation. Their prices have risen faster than inflation. It's not inflation's fault. They've done it, but they're trying to avoid responsibility and they're blaming inflation. Comics have done much the same things. In 1972, I had some comics from back then when I was very little. Comics would cost 12 cents. 10 cents in some cases. They just want 12 cents. Okay. Today they cost, $5, $7, $10. Sales of comics are 1/10, less than 1/10 of what they were 3.5 decades ago. Less than 1/10, in words. And they all blame it's inflation. It's inflation. If comic prices had gone up like, matching the state inflation rate, comics would be costing about $1.20, maybe $1.50. In fact, if you get what's called a marquee comic, smooth stuff and stuff like that, those may cost you, 18, $20. Now sales are I said less than 1/10 what they were back then. Not back in the 70s. It's only one say back when they were in the very early 90s. Now they tend a lot of people say, oh, inflation, technology, computers, online, oh, blah, 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 blah. Japanese manga, which is basically Japanese comics, is selling more in Japan today than they did 36 years ago, even though Japan's population is smaller. Only a little bit. But Japan's young people are a lot smaller. In other words, the generation people think of buying comics is a lot smaller in Japan than it was 36 years ago. Here's something interesting. More Japanese manga sells in the United States than sells Marvel or DC. In other words, people go and buy lots of Japanese manga in the United States to read. They don't buy Marvel and DC, the other comic book company stuff. That has nothing to do with inflation. That's to do with what? Japan makes stuff that people want. In the United States, in comics and movie industry, they make things that people who make it want to make. They're not worried about what the customers want. The customers should just listen to their betters. In other words, they are arrogant. So they are being punished for failing to meet the needs of their customers. It's just you have a lot of large megacorps who are willing to use shareholders' money unethically to back these people's dreams. Because go back to the guy who's head of Disney. In other words, I'm Disney. If I'm the head of Disney, I have to deal with the fact of what? I have seen my two major IPs, superhero movies, Marvel, and Star Wars, bite the bloody dust. And you know what the first thing he does is attack the fans and say, oh, it's a bunch of Trump people. It's a bunch of toxic masculinity. DEI is great stuff and stuff like that. That's not pop. That's just reality. Those other people, they're talking their politics, their culture war. And if they just do what I want, it would all be good. No, he's doing what? He's trashing the fans. You trash the fans, you don't get the fans to show up. But he's also going to blame inflation. It reminds me going back to government role number 2. I'd antitrust Disney. I'd just break it down to 20 small corporations. They'd all still be mega, billionaire corporations, but then they wouldn't be able to try to shuffle money between different divisions to hide losses. Okay, if you're not good, governments can have both in high unemployment and high inflation, or what's called stagflation when I was a kid. In other words, you can get stagflation. The print almost say here, how very efficient of them. Arrogance and stupidity in one nice tidy package. How very efficient of you. Governments have achieved that. When we go to monetary policy, we'll see that. And governments have achieved this. In fact, the 70s were marked by this. I can't go to the previous side, but go back to comic books. My older brother, he bought comics. I first read some of his. First ones he had gotten, they cost 10 cents. By the time you got, inflation was, semi-done, comics were costing 75 cents. But unemployment stayed high. That was stagflation. We got tagged. Okay, thank you very much.